just you and I.
All right, now that we've covered the core elements of infrastructure as a service, let's discuss the specific risks to consider when using infrastructure as a service. In this lesson, we're going to cover the common threats to infrastructure as a service and talk about how we identify and address these risks. Now, I want to go over a few definitions before we go any further. A threat in this context is anything that can cause damage or disruption to a cloud-based system. A vulnerability is a weakness that could be exploited by a threat, and a risk is a probability that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. It's very important to know these definitions for the exam, and I'll be referring to them going forward. All right, infrastructure as a service risks, personnel risks. So as we said in the last module, we can't really vet the vendors that supply the hardware to infrastructure as a service, and we don't really have much visibility into the data center activity. Now, you can audit those items, and it's somewhat difficult to actually audit a data center. Many hosting providers do not allow people to go into their data center even for auditing purposes. And you can review the policies that are provided by the data center. However, you really don't have that much assurance that that those policies are being followed unless you look at a third-party audit report, but there are even some limitation to those. So let's talk about some of the risks that are caused by that. Personnel threats. Because of the lack of visibility into what's going on in the data center, you really are trusting the hosting provider to hire appropriate people who won't be tempted to, or potentially not receive the necessary training to make mistakes that could impact your environments and infrastructure as a service. And many organizations, they address this by having background checks to ensure that there aren't any temptations in a person's background that might lead them to commit some kind of fraud or sabotage. The other thing is important is segregations of duties to ensure that no one really has the ability to do anything that might be too malicious or impactful for the customer environments that are hosted in infrastructure as a service. There are always external threats. These are threat actors who might be deploying malware, which is malicious software, onto the cloud-based systems. Denial of service or distributed denial of service refers to an attack on availability where threat actors try to use an individual endpoint or many different machines to overwhelm the capacities of a cloud-based system. Man-in-the-middle attacks are those where a threat actor tries to intercept information when it's being transmitted. And one of the other aspects that are external threats to infrastructure as a service are geographic risks. If your hosting provider is in an area where there are a lot of either physical disasters such as storms, earthquakes, etc., or it may be hosted in an area where there's a lot of political unrest, and that may shut off services or affect the performance of that data center. Now, that is a fairly remote possibility because most large-scale hosting providers have significant geographic diversity, but if you are only utilizing one specific data center, that's a very important risk to consider. Another risk that's really for the cloud customer to consider is that, as we said, infrastructure as a service provides the most control over the environments. The customer is really maintaining those operating systems and environments that are hosted on the cloud provider's hardware. Now that has a lot of different tasks involved in maintaining the security as well as the operational capacity of those environments. And every organization has to take a hard look at their IT and security resources and say, do we really have the specific skill set to maintain the operational security practices for this environment? Now, every person probably potentially is up to the challenge of learning how to do this properly, but an organization should really weigh the risks of their bench depth in terms of moving to the cloud. All right, quiz question. What is the most significant risk that a customer can evaluate and control in infrastructure as a service? Is it personnel threats, external threats, or lack of a cloud-specific skill set? The answer? Lack of a cloud-specific skill set. And I think this is, in some ways, a very hard risk to mitigate, because when you have to evaluate your organization's capacity, you may have personal connections to many of the people in IT or security and want to give them the benefit of the doubt. So it's difficult to sometimes look at an organization's capabilities in a dispassionate way, which really determines, do we need to bring in consultants? Do we really need to leverage a managed services provider to get the most out of the cloud and ensure we're doing it in a secure fashion? All right, in this module, we talked about the different threats, vulnerabilities, and risks, and we talked about the common risks when using infrastructure as a service, and we talked about some of the controls that organizations can provide to address some of these risks. All right, see you in the next lesson.